In today's video, we are talking about some tips to make your presentations more interesting, more enjoyable for you and your audience, and to make them overall more professional. My name is Chris. I'm a business English coach and tutor. I spend my whole professional life these days helping international professionals who use English as a second language to improve their English communication skills. And let's get started. To begin with, let's talk about questions. And we're going to talk about questions in both directions. Questions for you, the presenter, and questions for your audience. Questions you are going to ask. Let's start with questions you are going to ask. Tell me if this sounds familiar. You're sitting watching a presentation and it's 10 minutes long, 15, 20 minutes long. You're getting a little bored, starting to fall asleep. How can we avoid this? One great way to do this is, instead of just presenting information, offering this as a question. So if it's a presentation about customer service, how long do you think the average customer service call lasts with our company? Or how many customer service calls do you think we get every day? Or maybe just a question about the project that you're working on. What do you think the most expensive part of this project is going to be? Get some disagreements, some answers, and then tell them. Give them the information that you have for them. Or maybe it's for the accounting department. Which part of our company do you think is spending the most money right now? Get some opinions and then give them the answer. It's far more engaging, far more interesting for your audience if you ask for the information before you give it. And while we're here, let me ask you, what do you think of that tip? Is it a good tip? Is it a bad tip? Would it work for you? Maybe you think that your style of presentation, it wouldn't quite be right. So that's my question for you today. And I'd love to read your answers down in the comments. Let's start a conversation. Okay, let's keep going and let's talk about taking questions. Now, a really common thing is to take questions right at the end of your presentation. You give the whole thing and then you say, "Does anyone have any questions?" This is fine. It's a pretty good way to do it, but in my opinion, more engaging presentations are when they are a two-way conversation, when you're exploring the information together with your audience instead of just presenting it to them. Think about the best lectures you had at university or the best classes you had at school. They weren't just lecturers or teachers giving you information. They were usually conversations, interesting debates where people shared opinions. If you can do this with your presentations, then you will always be giving people an interesting, engaging, and high quality experience. So, let's look at some ways that you can invite questions throughout your presentation. We can use phrases like, "Is there anything you'd like me to clarify on this slide?" "Does anyone have any questions before we move on?" If anyone has any questions, I'm all ears. Feel free to jump in with any questions. Would anyone like to ask any questions at this point? Okay. Those are all pretty good, but they're very wide, very general invitations for questions. What can be far better is if you get really specific. For instance, this point right here. Does anyone have any questions about this? Because for me, it was definitely difficult to get my head around and understand when I was building this presentation. So is this clear for everyone? So there's a little discussion about questions. Getting questions from your audience and giving questions to them. But let's take that last point about specific things on your slides. And let's talk about guiding your audience's eyes, guiding and helping your audience understand your presentation. Now, of course, a good rule, a good place to start is to include as little information as possible on your slide. Your slides should help you. They should support what you're saying and the presentation that you're giving. But you should never be reading from your slides. Here are 2 slides that I like to show during my business English class on presentations. This is how rivers are formed. I found it by doing a Google search for worst PowerPoint slides. I think this is pretty bad. But also, we can see this slide here from an Apple keynote presentation. Mr. Tim Cook there, standing there, giving his presentation. And we can see that the difference here is huge. This is a night and day difference. And the reason this second slide, this Apple slide, is better is that there's less information on it. If you put a lot of information in front of your audience, then what are they going to do? They're going to read it, probably. Or worse, they'll just ignore it. And whichever of these happen, they're probably not paying attention to you. There are 2 ways that we can solve this. So, number 1 is less information on your slide. A very small amount of words, only the essentials. And the second one is if you really insist on complicated slides, if you think that you don't have a choice, then think about finding a way to guide your audience's eye, to show them what you want to focus on. For instance, by highlighting bits of information, or by revealing slowly the individual pieces of the slide that you want them to focus on. We can say things like, I'd like to draw your attention to this part of the slide. I'd like to draw your attention to this part of the slide. Or maybe, what I'd like to highlight is this piece of the chart right here. What I'd like to highlight is this piece of the chart right here. Or maybe, I just want to focus for a moment on this key point. I want to focus for a moment on this key point. So, simple slides are better, but if you have a really complicated slide, then guide the eyes of your audience and use some phrases to point out some key ideas. If we are using slides with pictures or graphs or charts or maybe even videos, then we can call these images visual aids. Visual aids can be really useful for communicating ideas. They are far more interesting than text. Remember our How Rivers Are Formed slide there. Indeed, a picture would definitely be more interesting. So, let's have a look at some phrases we can use around images. I've included a couple of pictures here that I think really tell the story. I've included a couple of pictures here that I think really tell the story. I want to make this a little more vivid, so here are some pictures of what I'm talking about. I want to make this a little more vivid, so here are some pictures of what I'm talking about. Right now, I'd like to illustrate this with a short video. right now I'd like to illustrate this with a short video. Illustrate is a fantastic word here. Illustrations are the pictures that we see in books, often children's books, showing us what is happening in the story. So when we use the word illustrate professionally, then we're talking about using images to show and communicate what we are saying. No one likes to sit there for 20 minutes and see a wall of text. Use some images, give your audience something interesting to look at. Okay, let's go for one last point here. And for me, this is really important. I was working with someone in Japan recently, helping them to make a presentation that they were going to give at a job interview. It was a presentation about the industry and the situation of that company in that industry, their position. And after a few minutes, we realized something was missing. We were looking for 10, 20 minutes trying to find what it was. It was a boring presentation. We knew it was boring and there was a reason for this. We looked at the first slide, couldn't find out why it was boring from that. The fifth slide, no, that was fine. What was it that was making this presentation boring? So one more time, he gave me this presentation. We went through the whole thing. And when we got to the end, we realized that the reason his presentation was boring was that he didn't include a story. So my last tip for you today is to include a story. Stories keep things interesting. They pull you out for a moment, out of the information and the technical things that you're talking about, into the real world, the interesting world that we all live in and work in together. They take cold, boring information and turn it into real human connection. And the best stories, like the one I just gave you there, they hold information back. They create suspense, a little bit of tension. There's something that you know as the presenter that your audience doesn't know. So think about telling a story in your next presentation. And when you're telling that story, if you really want to make it great, try to find some information in that story that you can hold back, that you cannot tell them until the last minute. This is going to build interest in this story, and then you can release this tension and give them that information. This could be something like, when I was working on this presentation, I realized there was something that I didn't know, a piece of information that I really needed, but just didn't have. Or maybe, when I was putting this presentation together, I quickly realized there was someone I needed to talk to, someone whose input and opinions were going to be crucial to creating the best presentation possible. Or maybe something like, at the end of our meeting last week, I realized there's something that we hadn't discussed. And I went to my manager, spoke about it, and she agreed this was an incredibly important thing to discuss. What was it? What was that thing? What is that information that you're holding back? If you want to book some of my time to help you improve your English communication skills, then leave a comment down below and I will send you a link for how you can do that. If you would like to see the kind of thing that I do every single day with international English speakers around the world, then take a look at this video over here, where I take a look at the English skills of the President of France and give him a couple of tips on how he might improve. Thanks a lot, everyone. See you next time.